Hello, everybody. Welcome to October's Censorship Series program. I'm your host, Mandy Sally, Chief Operating Officer of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. And I'm really excited about our program this month. I know I say that every month, but that's because they're always exciting. We're going to be talking about art and censorship, and particularly the digital censorship that art and artists are facing right now on social media and what we can do about it. We haven't really talked directly about art as a part of the series yet, so I think that we're all in for a treat. We're all going to learn a lot today. So in a minute, I'm going to take you to meet our panelists who are both brilliant and fabulous and wonderful. I'm so happy to have them with us. But before we get started, a few housekeeping things. Feel free to make use of that Zoom chat. I would love to hear your reactions, your questions, your comments to what we discussed today. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat or comments. I will also be posting the recording of this program to Woodhull's YouTube page afterwards. So if you can't stay for the entirety of our conversation today, don't fret, you can watch it at your leisure on YouTube later. And I'm also going to be sending out a follow-up email. So I know that our panelists today are going to mention some really wonderful resources, and I'm going to send you links to anything they mention, as well as how to connect with them afterwards. So don't need to jot down anything furious notes or anything like that, because I will send that all to you afterwards. So thanks again for being here today, and let's meet our wonderful panelists. All right. Well, hello to both of you. Thank you so much for being here today to talk about your work and art and censorship. I am so excited to have Elizabeth, you here from the National Coalition Against Censorship, and Emma, you from the Don't Delete Art campaign. You're both fabulous allies. We've worked with you in the past, but I would love for you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about you and your work to our audience. And Elizabeth, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks so much for this introduction and for inviting us to be here to talk about this today. I'm Elizabeth Larison. I am the director of the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. And I'm also a member of Don't Delete Art. At NCAC, the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program works to defend artistic expression among artists, curators, playwrights, authors in the United States. We defend art and culture and try to make sure that artistic expression is protected in all realms in the US.
And Emma, tell us about yourself.
I'm Emma Shapiro, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me and us as part of Don't Delete Art. I'm the editor at large for Don't Delete Art. I'm also an artist and an arts writer. And with Don't Delete Art, I help write the newsletter that comes out periodically, maintain the website. We have a gallery and resources, and we're always trying to find ways to help advocate for artists in the digital space who are facing censorship.
Yeah, and we're going to get into more about the manifesto and the campaign later on in our program. I think I would encourage everybody listening to check it out. I know I've really gotten a lot from your website and your social media posts, but before we really get into it, I want to talk about what art and censorship is looking like in 2023. So could you share with us a little bit, sort of, generally what the state of art and censorship is right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take that question. The status of art and censorship depends greatly on location and context, right? Of course, various countries around the world, controversial artwork can result in anything from professional demotions to jail time to threats on the life of the artist. In the US, where NCAC primarily focuses, artistic censorship largely looks like artwork being pulled from exhibitions either before or after the work has gone up, or it looks like exhibitions being canceled before or after they have gone up. And it also looks like self-censorship, which is when more or less artists or curators or other creatives feel pressure to change or alter their artwork out of a fear that it's controversial or that certain ideas are not welcome to be explored. Whatever the case, though, it's even in the US, even though it's not as severe in some other countries, it still is very serious because it not only restricts what artists can present and explore publicly, but it also affects what audiences can readily access and can restrict the exchange of ideas in the public sphere. A few common themes that we see in art censorship in the US is art that depicts nudity, art that is critical of religion, art that is critical of government agencies or actions, whether past or present, and art that reveals or probes painful histories in the US, whether it's, say, like the Jim Crow era or what have you. But of course, also, and a large focus of our conversation today will be art that is suppressed online. And that's another key thing that we see at NCAC and in DDA. This is where private companies create and enforce guidelines for access or participation that omit or prevent certain artwork from being seen or from being shared. And in that realm, censorship sort of looks like photography is not treated as art in the same way that sculpture, drawing, and painting are. In sculpture, drawing, and painting, depictions of nude or nude appearing figures are totally fine. But in lens-based works like photography or film, video, there's no protection there. Also, of course, sometimes algorithms can misread images. We see downranking of images that suggest nudity, but that don't show nudity. So examples of where you might have flesh-toned clothing or underwear on for many dancers might perform in these types of outfits. Those types of images in photography will be downranked or hidden. And we also see censorship related to functionality problems. For example, artists can't share their own work, but their galleries can, because an artist account might be downranked because they use a lot of nude suggestive imagery. And the list goes on. There's so many different ways that these types of images can be downranked. And also, I just add that much in the way that nude bodies don't always speak to sex and sexuality, we also are seeing issues of censorship affecting works that, say, address the opioid crisis or school shootings, and they get conflated with promotions of violence or drug trafficking and so on and so forth.
Muted myself, censoring myself here today. From your perspective as an artist, how does censorship feel to you?
Well, I entered the advocacy space because I was an artist who was experiencing suppression and censorship online. And the first time I experienced that was in 2017, I believe. And at the time, that was my first experience with what I considered to be censorship and led me to be angry, confused. At the time, it was a little bit more chaotic online. We didn't have access to appeals really, or at all maybe. And our notifications were very vague, they weren't specific. And there wasn't much of a community of artists understanding why this was happening, talking amongst themselves. Our accounts were being taken down entirely, what felt like on a whim. So things like that have changed. Thanks to Don't Delete Art and the National Coalition Against Censorship, in large part. There have been a lot of developments in social media as to being able to appeal, being able to understand why your artwork is being taken down, and being able to advocate for yourself even just a little bit, or at least having a place like Don't Delete Art to turn to, for example. But while it has become less chaotic, it has gotten a little bit more specific. And now that artists are able to understand why their art is being taken down, it brings up a whole other host of issues that we are aware of. The fact that, like, okay, my body in my artwork is being sexualized without my intent, my consent, or a really good appeals process for me to be able to stand up for my work and explain why it shouldn't be sexualized the way it's sexualized, or why it shouldn't be removed, why it is art and therefore should be allowed to stay up. So the landscape has changed. The community has grown because more artists have experienced this kind of censorship over time. And it is at times still just as frustrating.
Yeah. Well, and I think, censorship of art and artists is certainly not new in the world, right? it is evolving and changing, as you alluded to, Emma. But I wonder if we can talk a little bit about, of course, very briefly, if that's possible, what censorship of art and artists has looked like historically. Because I think sometimes it's helpful to understand the historical perspective when we're talking about how to advocate against it today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a couple of examples, and no particular, these are just things that stand out to me. But in the 1500s, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which has a lot of nudity, shows God reaching out to Adam to touch each other's fingers. This was seen as amoral and irreligious and denounced by a cardinal in the Catholic Church. There was a whole campaign organized as the Campaign of Fig Leaves to paint over the nudity in the frescoes. In 1815, famous painting by Goya, the Maja Desnuda, was censored during the Spanish Inquisition. This was a private commission kept in somebody's private house, and the person who commissioned it received a summons inquiring if he had the painting, why he had the painting, why he had commissioned it. And this was all, again, because of the Inquisition, in which even biblically inspired religious artwork was subject to censorship by the Catholic Church. So that's another example. And just three more, of course, famously in Nazi Germany during the 30s and the 40s, they viewed basically any modern art that didn't sort of, use sort of classical realistic depictions of people and landscapes and what have you. They viewed it all as degenerate. And so famously, they gathered it all. Some of it they destroyed. Some of it they actually had an art exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And it was largely, after that, sort of stolen and hidden and, removed from public view. And then in more recent history, Penny Slinger had an artist book confiscated at the UK border in the 70s or 80s, I believe. And because that had sexual themes in it. And in 1989, Chris O'Feely painted an artwork called The Holy Virgin Mary, which depicts a Black Virgin Mary. And the work also incorporates elephant dung throughout it. And that was displayed at New York's own Brooklyn Museum. And the then mayor, Giuliani, called it sick stuff and attempted to sue the museum because of this artwork. So these are just 5 examples that kind of take us through history. But I just want to give a small plug, and maybe we can drop a link in the chat for Censorpedia, which is an online boutique wiki resource, which has grown out of a new media project by the artist Montadas called The File Room. But it basically allows people to track and add their own censorship incidents to kind of keep this large online document about where and how censorship has happened. And there's also an NCAC censorship timeline, which is a little bit more bespoke, but focuses on art censorship within the last century, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a great resource. And I want to ask a question about one of the examples you gave. Would you say it was in the 1500s in Spain? It was artwork in somebody's own private home.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I can share more information, but we actually have a Wikipedia or a Censorpedia, excuse me, post about that as well, which details actually the many times in which this artwork has been viewed as controversial. So that would be another great thing to put in the chat, which people can read more about it there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will include that in my follow-up email as well. Because I think, knowledge is power, right? We can't do anything about it if we don't know it's happening. So thank you for those examples. Particularly that example I asked about, but I had no idea about Giuliani's trying to sue the Brooklyn Museum in 1989. So very interesting. So we're going to be talking a lot about digital censorship today. But I think there's lots of different kinds of censorship that artists are facing. And you alluded to this, each of you, in your introductions. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that. Some of the other places we're seeing censorship of art and artists. I guess offline for now, and then we'll talk more specifically about social media and online next.
So speaking more specifically about the kinds of censorship that we're seeing offline. Okay. Well, it's we don't have perfect stats on this at NCAC because so oftentimes art censorship happens behind closed doors, and we only hear about it when people speak up about it. And for many artists, that can be a scary thing if they, have a cherished commission that they finally, have been contacted for, or if they're working with a particular public space or venue or airport or what have you. They don't want to jeopardize. They don't want to jeopardize this opportunity that they have to show and share their work. So all to say, it can be a lot of pressure on those involved, and we don't always hear about it. And similarly, there isn't always media attention for these things. But we do see a fair amount of censorship in private institutions, which is to say non-governmental art spaces, and as well as government-run art spaces. In the past year, for example, there was an art exhibition at a state-funded school in Idaho, and it was the exhibition was dealing with issues of healthcare, and there were several artworks which addressed abortion as healthcare, and they were all removed, or some of them were had elements removed from the artworks because the school was worried about violating a no public funds for abortion law, which is currently or was up in Idaho at that time. So here we had artwork, which some of it, for example, one of the works referenced letters written to Margaret Sanger in the earlier part of the 20th century, and which were from women who had received abortions or sought abortions, or who, whatever, just describing their experience. And just the main representation of these women's words was enough to have it be read as endorsement of abortion as a particular service. So, that's an example that I'll give today. It's something that NCAC spoke out about, along with collaborators from other organizations like the ACLU of Idaho and the ACLU National. I believe the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression also, spoke out about this. But this is censorship happening. These are artists that are no longer able to explore certain ideas because of fear about how certain laws are structured. So in that case, it had to do with the school basically saying that they didn't want to lose funding and they didn't want to become vulnerable to a lawsuit within their own state.
Yeah, and we participated actually in a panel just about that case with Fire. Ricky Levy
amazing.
moderated it. So we interviewed the authors, not the authors, the artists about their experience and whatnot. Also in Idaho, educators are suing around that same bill because they feel their curriculum has been censored at the public universities. So far-reaching implications of that No Funds for Abortion Act in Idaho. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on online. And Emma, I wonder if you could share a little bit more about your experience of what online censorship and social media censorship has been like for you and other artists that are part of DDA.
Well, it can effectively make you invisible, and the ripple effects of it are really broad. Social media and also our online space, these are tools for artists, and they were wonderfully democratizing for a time being. Like, there was a dream that was Instagram, where artists were able to show their work no matter where they live, no matter what their education was. They were having access to audience. They were being picked out from that space for exhibitions. And but that has changed, right? And thanks to all different kinds of algorithm restructuring and yada yada that goes on with say Meta. Meta is the biggest issue that artists are dealing with because it's a visual medium, unlike say Twitter or X. But when artists are suppressed or censored or have their artwork taken down or their account taken down, they are effectively invisible on that space. They're unable to be seen by new audience. They are barely seen by their own audience. And the effect of that could also mean that galleries are not going to show their work on their own accounts for worry of being suppressed or that artwork being taken down, which does happen. So you could be part of an exhibition but not be promoted on social media as being part of that exhibition. Or, the further implication that we do worry about is that maybe in the future you might not be selected to be part of that exhibition because it risks too much in these online spaces. And this isn't just about social media, this is also about uh, websites, newsletter platforms, payment processors, the kinds of things that are now affecting social media are affecting the rest of the internet. And we can talk more about that in a future question, I think, to discuss more about like how legislation is now affecting the online space and artists' ability to express themselves along with a lot of other suppressed creators. But yeah, it's a very real issue that is often trivialized, this suppression and erasure of artists online, but it has been having a very real effect on the kind of artwork that we get to see.
Yeah, and we've heard very similar experiences from our sort of broader community at Woodhull, folks working in the sexuality realm in any way, shape, or
Mhm,
form, whether that be explicit in sex worker porn or not
mhm,
explicit sex educator, sex therapist, folks just talking about maybe being polyamorous, whatever the case
yeah,
may be, having very similar experiences. And I think what the broader, public, for lack of a better term, fails to realize is this has a direct impact on people's livelihoods and their ability to feed their families, pay their bills, all of those things. And so I want to just sort of pick on what you said there about how sometimes these issues are trivialized, because it's really important that they're not, right? It's we're taking away
yeah.
access to something that is important, right? Art and artistic expression from the average social media user, but also really hurting artists with a tool that actually used to make things, it sounds like, um, potentially better for artists or able to market themselves more broadly. Does that
Mhm.
sum that up?
Yeah, we ultimately have become dependent on these online spaces and for good reason. The liberty that it gives to artists and creators who are not able to access the same kinds of like physical or local platforms that we've depended on in the past to get exposure as artists. For example, moving to New York City or being able to move your artwork around basically. it's it's been an critical tool for artists, and to have this be so imbalanced where uh, many creatives are just do not have equal access, the implications are huge.
And also
Yeah.
to add too, so many of the works that will get downranked or removed from social media platforms have the same kind of content that would be fine to have in a museum for general audiences. And that's always
Mhm.
been a huge sticking point for us at NCAC and DDA. Like, why are we penalizing images that could be seen in a museum?
Right, right. Yeah, and I would love if you could give our attendees a little bit of a walkthrough of what happens when an artist is censored online. Like, just sort of give us an example of, like, let's just take Instagram and Meta, since they seem to be one
Mhm.
of the top offenders here.
Mhm.
How does an artist discover they've been censored, and what happens next? Kind of just walk us through that experience.
Well, when it comes to social media, uh, currently you will open your app and get a notification, most likely if your artwork has, or if your content has been removed or your account has been erased, right? But if your artwork is being suppressed, which, this is something that we once called the shadow ban, now has been more broadly understood as downranking, suppression, all different kinds of actions that Meta, for example, is taking against work or content that violates their recommendation guidelines. You don't get a notification necessarily about that. So you got to find it out. And just like a lot of other things with Meta, you tend to have to find things out. But you will get a notification if your work has been removed or your account has been removed. When it comes to like if you're having issues with a payment processor or other kinds of like for example, like Vimeo or like Linktree or all kinds of things that artists use to show their work. or share their work. It's all very different, depends on the size of the company. Most likely you will not be notified, or you might get an email. And the process can either be really hands-on, where you have a back and forth with people in the company, or nothing at all, right? And we hear from a lot of artists who are facing this kind of issue and, send us screenshots of their email back and forth with these companies. And basically nobody ends up getting their accounts back or really getting what they want. In the end, you're not usually very well able to argue against their content moderation or how they're dealing with artwork that is dubbed uh, inappropriate for whatever website they are. So it really depends. When it comes to, say, Meta, though, they are such a black box. They still maintain to be a black box, and regular users are unable to contact anybody inside to directly appeal their case. There might be a button that you can appeal with, and maybe you can send your case up to the oversight board, but beyond that, there's no way to plead your case. Elizabeth.
I just want to add one thing. Going back to Meta and their recommendations, just last year, after a lot of pressure, they revealed what it means to be unrecommendable, which is, the a parallel term for, falling under the shadow ban or being downranked, but Meta likes to call it being unrecommendable, which is, certain interfaces that allow your content to be found by non-followers. And those guidelines around those recommendation guidelines are much more stringent than the community guidelines. So, even though your artwork may follow the community guidelines, for example, if you blur any nudity in your artwork, you still will not be able to be found easily. So, much like, the other things that Emma mentioned, where you'll see a little pop-ups, signal, you'll see certain images that identify that, that are certain images that are not, able to be found by non-followers. However, there's something else which, speaking to the black box that Emma just referenced, there's also ways in which an entire account can be unrecommendable. And there's some percentage of posts or number of posts that earn an account that kind of unrecommendable status, but it's there's not a whole lot of clarity for when that sort of status times out, or how somebody can completely remove that sort of unrecommendable status from their account.
Also, we're seeing a lot of developments, like, for example, like Elizabeth pointed out, the recommendation guidelines and the new recommendation guidelines violations, where it's telling you that, like, we're not going to show non-followers your work because it might violate our guidelines. We're not sure, but it might. This sort of vagueness, but it is taking the veil off of what we knew was happening all along under the shadow ban. And a lot of this is coming from potentially the Digital Services Act in Europe, which is requiring companies to be transparent, to tell users when their content is being actioned on, and how, why, maybe if it's been done with AI or not, and how they can appeal it, right? So we saw this being implemented with Meta very soon after the enactment of the DSA in Europe, and that kind of transparency is very positive. But we also have our suspicions that it is also a way to get artists to remove more content, or to get creators to remove more content in order to get out of, like, the doghouse of not being recommendable.
Yeah, it sounds like it's sort of a digital version of what a lot of First Amendment folks would call, like, the chilling effect of speech,
Yes.
right? Of, like, it's not blatantly saying you can't do it, but people are self-censoring essentially. And I also want to point out that it's your content doesn't have to be removed to be censorship, right? It's like, what's the point of putting it on social media if nobody's eyeballs are going to get to it, right? Sort of a more nefarious version of censorship, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it effectively works in a very similar fashion and is harder to argue against.
Right. but it's still a number for, Meta, right? It's like you're still
Mhm.
making them money, right? Because you're still a user on their platform, which you're supporting their um, stats, right?
Mhm.
Without getting any of the benefits to your business or whatever the case may be.
100%. I think what you're describing is that sort of like it's a cost-cutting measure, they're just trying to protect themselves, not spend a lot of money or resources in making more nuanced policies or review processes for these types of content. And it's cheaper for that. Yeah, like, we all still use these things, right? And it can be really hard on artists. One other thing I just wanted to add to the ways in which artists, deal with or learn of this censorship is, we mentioned the violations, but something that we're seeing a lot is what we call Instagram purgatory, where in the downranking section or in the recommendations guidelines section, artists might see, a certain number of posts that are in violation of the recommendations guidelines. And if they archive or remove one of their posts, you think, they would have one less, violation. Sometimes we're seeing artists report that more violations pop up. So it's sort of like a game of whack-a-mole where they don't really have a clear sense of where their account stands, and they might not know until that they've suppressed themselves in their own work to the point of which the whole reason they have as many followers as they do is because people like this content, right? But they're being told that in order to get more followers, they have to essentially change the nature of their account. Um, and there are other ways in which artists never know if they're being suppressed, but they can see the results. So, an example that we have is, there's an artist that we work with who had an image that had like a bunch of men with soccer balls. Spencer Tunick has a sea of humans, male humans holding a soccer ball, and it's sort of like a wide frame lens. And image he was able to hashtag, with an affiliation with a museum, I believe, and that image showed up. But when he had a parallel image with women holding soccer balls, all other nudity blurred or covered, that image was not visible in the hashtags, but there was no notification that one would be found and the other wouldn't. And so there's a little bit of gaslighting going on also. There's information that artists are not totally given with regards to what makes their content findable and whatnot, and they're just sort of left to guess. One final example, and I'm sorry, there's so many, and it's hard to not talk about them all. But if an artist has two accounts, maybe one for their nude work and one for other photography, like Savannah Spirit, a member of DDA, has two accounts. One has some recommendations violations, the other one doesn't. But based on the performance of her posts in her recommendable account, she has reason to believe that both accounts are being downranked, but she's not told about the downranking of the other one. So it feels very insidious. It feels very duplicitous to the artists who are trying to work with some of these guidelines.
And just on that note about the artists who are trying to work with these guidelines, I mean, we've arrived at a point now where, artists have been dealing with the topic of their posts being taken down and why, and, adult nudity and sexual activity violations, which is what we most often we're seeing, and have come up with ways to, evade this, to abide by the guidelines. They have even changed their practice or developed entire new bodies of work to just be able to be present on social media. And now, and then we're suspecting that they were being shadow banned, now have confirmation that they're being shadow banned, and also still questions about it. And it's just like, a very interesting evolution of what it means to be an artist online.
Yeah, and we've heard similar stories, right, from our community of not knowing. I don't know if either of you are familiar with Dr. Carolina R. She goes by Blogger on Pole online. Yeah. So I feel like I'm quoting her all the time, but she has great research around a lot of this stuff. Yeah, and talks about this stuff like really eloquently. I definitely encourage folks to check her stuff out. But I think it's interesting the example you just gave, Elizabeth, about the artist with the soccer balls. One of the things I'm talking about frequently in the series is how censors often target folks who are already at the margins of society, right? And so we've seen that a lot in the sexuality, broader community. Are you seeing the same thing in the art community? Are you hearing that from the folks who are part of DDA?
100%. Yeah, like the world online reflects the world offline, right? And it's an unfortunate extension. But we're seeing, I'm sure this has come up, and if it hasn't, then this would be a great link to share in the chat, which is a Guardian article that came out in February this year, in which two of their journalists did some experiments with some of the AI, which is predominantly used by social media companies. This is, state of the art stuff developed by Google and Microsoft, and they were essentially testing its ability to detect raciness in an image. And so they compiled sort of parallel types of images: men at the beach playing volleyball, women at the beach playing volleyball, men in underwear, women in underwear, people of all sexes partially, clothed or unclothed for medical procedures and what have you, and routinely found evidence that AI tags of photos with women in everyday situations are sexually suggestive, far more so than images of, male presenting people. So this is a huge thing, and the article is really great because they also show examples of how, the AI is detecting images in real time. So I'm so compelled by this one image of a shirtless man holding a bra, and as he brings the bra closer to his body, the image becomes more racy. He puts the bra on and it's very racy, so he's more racy clothed than he is unclothed. So that's a really interesting example, and I know Emma has some good examples to share too from another publication.
Yeah, a place that I've referenced a number of times is Salty, and they have done their algorithmic bias reports. I think their latest one was in 2021, but that algorithmic bias report confirmed that marginalized bodies and topics were being more often content moderated out, right? And they said that the most marginalized groups, the most prominent reason why they're being taken out of Instagram mostly is because of nudity, being flagged for nudity, and it was mostly affecting women and trans and non-binary bodies, right? And this is something that we see a lot in evidence with the artwork that we see. It usually has to do with LGBTQ themes or women's bodies, right? And so, of course, we're going to be seeing this with art. I mean, like, one of the biggest purposes of art is to explore visual representations of things worth discussing and issues of today and identity, right? So of course we're going to be seeing that work misunderstood, misread, miscategorized and removed from these online spaces. And it's creating this a vacuum where development is really, really difficult to do. So, for example, and this is something that I experience as a woman artist who uses her body in her work, right? Say a woman wants to use their body to, investigate the male gaze, to redefine the gaze, to reclaim her own body in art history, create new paths for how women's bodies are used in art. She's unable to do so if her artwork is automatically deemed, obscene, sexually explicit, illicit, what have you, and removed from these platforms and websites and all kinds of places where these kinds of images are being removed from.
And
No, go ahead, Elizabeth.
There's another example that just to me it's very striking to me, and it's an image that has been in the DDA gallery online for a while. It's a photograph by photographer named Ken Gruenholtz, but he posted this image in 2019 to his Instagram account, and I'll just describe it for you. It's a black and white photo. You have two men, both have shorts on, neither of them have shirts on. One man is seated in like a deep chair, and his hand is touching the mid thigh of the standing man who's like alongside the chair. That's pretty much it. There's no nudity, there's no pubic hair, there's no butts, there's no genitals, there's, two shirtless men standing near each other. One of them is sitting right. This image was marked as violating Instagram's community guidelines, which again are the guidelines which determine that it can't be on the app. This isn't just suppressed from being shared. This image is not allowed. And it was not allowed because on account of allegedly having nudity or sexually suggestive material. So the fact that there is no nudity and that the most sexually suggestive thing is that we have a same-sex couple standing near each other or in proximity with each other, and one of them is touching the other's thigh. That's sort of what we're left to conclude, that this is an issue of depicting a same-sex couple, which is being read as inappropriate by the algorithm. So this is one way in which we do see the extension of, discriminatory practices or, extensions of marginalization offline coming into the online spaces as well.
Yeah, and last year, something that we were seeing a lot of was this particular violation that was sexual solicitation. And it seemed to be, it was happening to a lot of LGBTQ plus creators, women artists, women creators. While at the same time, you could scroll through, your just say regular Instagram, regular for anybody, and see a ton of like very sexy images of, that were clothing brands or whatever, that weren't being taken down for violating sexual solicitation. So it was a very confusing event for a lot of artists. That came about because of the implementation of FOSTA SESTA, which affected, a lot of creatives online, particularly people who are using the body, people who are dealing with sexual themes, sex educators, sex workers, pole dancers, all kinds of people. This was basically a purge of a lot of content online, a misguided one. The effort was to try to eliminate sex trafficking from online spaces, but instead, because it made platforms like Meta liable for that kind of content existing on their sites, instead of paying more attention and creating more nuance within their content moderation, they just decided to push anything off that they thought was violating or could potentially make them liable for hosting sex trafficking content. But it was very interesting to see what things were flagged, and it was a lot of artists and a lot of marginalized communities who were exploring themes that had to, even nothing to do with sex.
Yeah, we're quite familiar with Sesta Foster here at Woodhull.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you brought it up. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have the conversation with the both of you today, because I feel like, FOSTA was, of course, negative in the very same ways you just said, Emma, to our broader sex work community. But I think out of something horrible, I think there's opportunity there, right? Like there's now some sort of shared bad experience to be able to speak from and hopefully work together to try and prevent similar kinds of bad legislation, bad actors. That's my hopefully not naive hope about conversations like this one, is that, we can learn from each other. Okay, what strategies did the broader sexual freedom community use to advocate? What's the art community doing? What can we do together, right? What can we do to support one another's efforts to not allow this kind of stuff to happen? And I think I say this every censorship program. While FOSTA may have been the first kind of big piece of legislation to create this kind of online censorship, it certainly will not be the last, right? I mean, I think we've got a lot of stuff coming down the pike, and I think both our organizations have talked a lot about what's out there, particularly in this legislative session. But I want to switch gears a little bit because I want to give our viewers some hope and some ideas about what they can do to advocate against this kind of censorship. And I think the Don't Delete Art campaign is one really wonderful example. And so I would love for you to share with us a little bit about the campaign, what it does, and how you're, standing up to the censors.
Yeah, well, one of the main things that Don't Delete Art does is it keeps a curated online gallery of artwork censored online. And this is, to me, this is incredibly important because this is sort of showcasing the work that doesn't otherwise get to be seen on a broad scale because of the mechanisms that we've been talking about. So it's giving visibility to the artwork that is going to be downranked or removed or shadow banned or, otherwise, suppressed. Um, so you can check that out. What's really great about the online gallery is that it also has, in the words of the artists, them describing what they've done. So, did they appeal? And for example, like in the Ken Grunholz story that I told earlier, he appealed and got denied. So we see examples of where the system is failing on multiple levels for many artists. We also have a newsletter, which Emma heads up with Savannah Spirit, covering new issues that kind of come up in this intersection of free expression and art online. We also have a blog on our website, which can include more stories from different types of creators and people in the field. We have resources for artists in the form of our tips page, which helps them sort of navigate and learn more about the policies, sort of what's known, what's not known in terms of what will get their art downranked online and how they can navigate this to the extent that they feel comfortable and trying to get their work seen on a broader scale. But also importantly, this past February, Don't Delete Art issued or launched its Don't Delete Art manifesto. This is a short piece of text that we're asking people to sign on to, largely from the arts community, but we welcome anybody to sign on. Essentially, the DDA manifesto, it was really meant to convene the art world in speaking out together, because so often these downrankings, these removals happen in isolation. It just seems like you and your phone in your living room, and suddenly you're denied access to something. What are you going to do? Who are you going to tell, right? This is a way for the arts community to come together and say, this is not appropriate to be censoring the arts in this way. Like I mentioned before, so much of this work is visible in museums and in other types of, offline spaces. Why are we suppressing it in an online space? So right now we have somewhere around 2,500 signatures from people in all over the world. Last I counted, I think we had more people from more than 80 different countries, and it's always growing. So we're always looking to add. We're using this to add pressure, to the social media companies to primarily bring artists and people from the arts into the conversations about how their algorithms are reading art, how we can advocate for different types of exemptions for art, or having a clear artistic context for work that would normally be sidelined simply because it's a lens-based work. But we're calling for greater representation how these of the arts community and how these policies are not just created, but how they're enforced, advocating for real human appeals and where possible, ways in which artists can advocate for their work in a greater way to demonstrate that it belongs within a consideration of art rather than however else the algorithms are reading it.
Mm-hmm. And Don't Delete Art, with Don't Delete Art, we've been dedicating ourselves lately to really trying to educate our art community on why these things are happening and the other communities that it's affecting in very same ways for the same reasons. We do believe that this is, we're part of a larger digital rights conversation, and that artists need to step into that space as a group. And so we're trying to pull all artists together to see that, as Elizabeth says, when this happens to them, it's a very lonely experience. You can feel very shameful, embarrassed about it. A lot of artists think that they did something wrong, and they need to know they didn't do anything wrong, and that there are people out there who can explain to them why that is, give them the tools to reach out to community, be able to speak about the issue, and learn about why it's happening. Now is a very critical time for us to reach out to platforms and social media companies to get them to make sure that artist voices are integrated into their algorithm design, AI, content moderation, because what is coming down the pike with a lot of this legislation, not just in the US, but also in Europe and the UK, and a lot of other places too, internet regulation, these companies are going to need to make sure they're protecting artists. Otherwise, we're going to see exactly the same thing that happened with Costa Sesta.
Yeah, absolutely. I've started to see the artist community be a part of that, like you said, Elizabeth, digital rights space. I think I recently saw Fight for the Future is doing something with artists and AI. So I also think something that is so unique and powerful about artists is they are incredibly talented and able to give us different ways to talk about these issues, right? And learn about these issues as both of you have expressed throughout our conversation today. Um, and so, I wonder if there's somebody listening today who is an artist who's just learning about you and maybe has just experienced something like this. Do you have any initial sort of tips or hacks or tricks that you would recommend they start with in dealing with this kind of censorship? Before they get a chance to get to your website and read all about it, what maybe should do first?
I would say first thing is don't despair. Um, know you're not alone and that you've done nothing wrong. I mean, that's the biggest step forward, right? Before they end up at Don't Delete Art. I think the next step should be for them to look up what communities and what digital rights groups are advocating for them and how they can get involved on Don't Delete Art. As Elizabeth pointed out, we've got lots of resources about how artists not only can, sign the manifesto, learn about new developments, see other artwork from artists who are also facing this, submit their artwork that has been um, actioned on social media and other platforms. But they can also learn like how they could better self-censor their artwork with pixels and whatnot to be able to make sure they aren't being taken down if that is a way that they want to move forward. Um, so just knowing that they're not alone, that's the biggest step for artists, right?
I would also add that, a big part of what we do with our tips page too is just making sure that people understand and know what the guidelines are. And then if they
Mhm.
really, if they feel that, wait, this doesn't represent my work, always appeal and, push back against, with these sort of categorizations that are placed on your work and defend it. And oftentimes we're hearing that there's a lot of the appeals processes now have real human review. It's not, I don't think it's 100%, but there's more of that happening. And just keep resisting, ask for appeals again, whatever the violation is. If you feel your work doesn't meet those categories, that
Mhm.
it's not a perfect tool, but these are among the tools that you have. And also knowing the rules of the space allows you to do just like what Emma said, determine whether and how you decide to self-censor, pixelate, or whatever as appropriate in order to get the broader reach to participate within the platform to the greatest extent possible.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Important to use the tools that are there, even though I understand it can be very a frustrating, kind of disheartening process going through. I think that's probably putting it lightly.
Yeah.
Um, but it is the recourse available at the moment, at least on the platform. Um,
Right.
so, we're getting towards the end of our time together. I feel like I could talk to both of you all day. I'm learning a whole lot. Um, but I have a question for both of you, and it relates to an experience I had hosting a panel for college age theater students earlier this
Mm,
month. And one of the
mhm.
professors who was there pointed out, that artists blend civic engagement and advocacy so beautifully in their work to create change. And so I would love to just hear from both of you your thoughts on that. How artists can blend those two things to advocate, in this case against censorship, but for many other changes in our world.
Emma, do you want to go, or either way?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is to uh, share if you're facing any kind of obstacles to your creation. Document it, share about it, find the community of artists that can support you, but also just don't stop doing your art, you know, like that's the most important thing, that you don't get, this doesn't stop you. As long as you keep putting your work out there into the world, it's going to keep pushing that boulder up the hill that hopefully won't slide down again, you know?
And to speak to your question, Mandy, I feel like, yes, arts that blend civic engagement and advocacy do create change, but I think even without actively blending civic engagement and advocacy, artists and art regularly provide new ways of looking at things. Sometimes they sort of frame things in a different way or combine certain ideas in a way that we don't typically see otherwise. And to me, I think that alone can undermine preconceived notions or prejudices and have huge implications about relationships of power in the world around us. So I think that often too has a sort of political valence, which can be very powerful and very important. And also, of course, art that integrates more directly or more overtly civic engagement and activism, for example. Of course, that also has a lot of power as well. And there's been a lot of great examples about that throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. And for
Before,
folks, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was saying that, like we mentioned before, you know, there are, as far as it goes for online censorship, there are a lot of artists who have taken that sort of as a prompt and are using the fact that their artwork has been censored to create new bodies of work, to play with their artwork, to they're they're discussing it now with their artwork, even if it isn't, you know, using the word censorship in it or being so obvious about it. Artists are really digesting this and putting work back out into the world. So once you understand that when you're online and you're seeing artwork, you're seeing the kind of artwork that artists are putting out there, it involves the fact that this is a space that isn't necessarily welcoming to artists and they have to navigate it. And so therefore they are taking part in this process of sort of activism in art just by existing on those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks who are listening today, they're definitely going to go check out the Don't Delete Art Gallery and read and hopefully sign the manifesto. I believe Woodhull is an organizational signer of the manifesto. But for, you know, some of the non-artists who might be listening, any resources you might recommend they check out or things they can do to support um, artists in not being censored?
Well, you know, if you are somebody who isn't an artist, but you're interested in art, you know, I would like for you to think about the kind of artwork that you like and the free expression that you appreciate, and understand that it's under threat, that there are artists out there that you might not be seeing that you would like to see because they're unable to get their work to you because of online censorship and suppression, and that it's a great opportunity for you to figure out how to get involved in making sure you can appreciate art, that you are allowed to also partake in the art experience to the level that you deserve to be. So understanding what kind of legislations are out there that you can contact your Congress people about to make sure there isn't chilling of freedom of expression online is a great step forward. So like, for example, you know, Fight for the Future has a great bad internet bills campaign, and a lot of digital rights organizations are talking about free expression online. It has to do with artists. Anytime you see the term human rights defender, that means an artist. You know, artists are part of this whole thing. So if you love art, you need to advocate for artists.
Absolutely.
Of course, seeing Don't Delete Art, but also reading art journals like, you know, Hyperallergic or the Art Newspaper, where um, they're they're publishing articles about this topic on a decently regular basis. They're trying to monitor art censorship around the world. You know, you can learn about it in a variety of ways.
Anything to add, Elizabeth?
I think just if people are curious about like what we're doing or want to support what we're doing in the vein of advocating for artists online, we'll obviously we have an Instagram account which regularly shares different types of stories from artists, shares the latest work that's kind of coming into us that's been censored. We also, as I mentioned, have a newsletter which is really interesting and vibrant. It comes out every 4 to 8 weeks. You can sign up for that on the DDA website. Obviously, sign the manifesto. And just recently, Don't Delete Art launched an online shop that has different types of merch that can help signal and kind of keep the visibility of this initiative out in public. And importantly, all the money that's raised from it goes to support the initiative, which right now it's a collaboration. It's an initiative between organizations like NCAC, PEN America's Artist at Risk Connection, Free Muse, and artist activists. All of that we do is donated and in-kind time. So supporting what we do through our merch, buying our merch, or even donations to the DDA website is incredibly helpful and helps us continue participating and keeping our communities informed of what the issues are at the intersection of free expression online.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. I have a lot of new things to think about that I hadn't even considered when it comes to censorship. So I appreciate both of your perspectives and your wisdom, and for taking some time out of your day to share with me and our audience. And everything you mentioned will be in the wrap-up email. So folks, be sure to click all of the links when you get that email from me. And we will see you next month. Thanks, Emma and Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for being here. I hope you learned something. I know I learned a whole lot. I'm feeling inspired, as I always am after these censorship programs. We will be back in November, and we're going to be talking about obscenity and obscenity law, what that is, what it's not, and how it gets misused to censor us here in the US. So be sure to look out for that on our website and register. And if you learned something today, if you enjoyed yourself, or if you're feeling inspired, head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate. We produce these programs and host them so that anybody can access them for free, but they are not free to produce. So we would appreciate any support you might be able to provide. Thanks, Kaylee, so much for interpreting for us today. And I will see everybody in November.